Next from Springfield, we offer part 2 of our one-on-one interview with journalist Mike Lawrence, who began his journalism career in 1964. During his lengthy career, Mr. Lawrence covered or worked with many of the leading political figures in Illinois, including Governor Ogilvie, Governor Jim Thompson, Governor Jim Edgar, and Senator Paul Simon. Mr. Lawrence is interviewed by his daughter, Illinois Channel board member Katie Lawrence. This runs about 40 minutes.
Welcome back. We're here today with Mike Lawrence, who I should acknowledge for the Illinois Channel audience, who is also my dad. In a previous segment, we have discussed the art of journalism today and yesterday. And now we're going to move into your coverage of your reporting career that started in 1964 and spanned, over 2 decades. And then, of course, your press secretary work and senior advisor with former Governor Jim Edgar. Let's start out with, who are some of the more colorful elected officials in Illinois that you had the privilege to cover, and some interesting stories that you would like to share with the viewers?
Well, one of the people I covered was a guy from Southern Illinois named Clyde Schote. He was a state representative and a power in the legislature during the 60s and 70s. Clyde was a Congressional Medal of Honor winner. He actually took on German tanks in World War II. And of course that's a high military honor to win that. Clyde would never bring it up himself, but he always had people with him who, when he was introduced, he'd say, "I'm Clyde Schote," and then they would say immediately, he's a former congressional, or he's a Congressional Medal of Honor winner. Clyde was involved in the longest fight to become Speaker of the House that we've seen in Illinois. It occurred in 1975. And the Democrats had a substantial majority, but they could not agree among themselves on who the Speaker ought to be. Most of the Democrats were for Clyde, but Governor Walker got involved. He was fighting Clyde. He had allies in the legislature. Anyway, there was a standoff. And the way it broke was when a freshman legislator from DuPage County named Lee Daniels, a Republican legislator, actually, they did the roll call orally, and when his name was called, and this is after scores of ballots where Republicans all voted for the Republican, the Democrats were split, Lee Daniels voted for Bill Redmond, who was a Democrat legislator from DuPage County. At that time, there was what they called minority representation. Well, the place went up for grabs. They didn't even finish the roll call. And I was covering this. I ran out onto the floor right for Daniel's desk because I knew that's where the action were. And these old Republican war horses were around him saying, "You are all through in the Republican Party. You are finished." Well, about 4 or 5 years later, guess who the House Republican leader was? You know who it was. It was Lee Daniels. So I've always enjoyed telling that story, for one thing, to illustrate how things change in politics, coalitions change. Lee Daniels looked like he wasn't going anywhere at that moment, and he ended up being the leader. There were other characters, of course, through the years. Jim Thompson was very colorful to cover, and the story we've always enjoyed telling in the family was about a neighbor in Davenport by the name of Jim Dietz, who had a former neighbor. We were now in Springfield, but for whatever reason, this Iowa guy had a fascination with Thompson, and he would always ask me about Thompson. Well, one day he flew down, he piloted his own plane, flew to Springfield for a business matter, and we had set it up for him to meet me in my office in the press room. where I walked into my office, and there was Governor Thompson on the couch, sprawled out on the couch in my office. Now, I didn't plan it that way, as we know. What had happened was that Thompson had criticized a story I had written in a television appearance over the weekend. And I had gone down to the press office and had it out with the press secretary over it. And I went back upstairs, and the next thing I knew, Thompson was walking into my office saying, I understand you and I have a problem. And then we sat down and talked about it, kind of laughed about it after a while. And then Jim Dietz walks in, and he was just, awestruck, really. But I don't want to get into a rambling answer here, but that was one of the things about Thompson. I mentioned earlier that Dan Walker had been governor. There was a confrontational atmosphere in the State House between the governor and the legislature, also between the governor and the media. And Governor Walker, for his last 2 years, came to the press room one time where, the reporters had their offices. And he came there because, as you know, attached to those offices in that suite was what they called the Blue Room, where politicians would do news conferences. Well, this was a situation where leaders of organized labor wanted Walker to be there for something they were doing. That was the one time in the last 2 years. Now, Thompson becomes governor, and he's a schmoozer. So he would come into the press room. Frankly, I think the statute of limitations is run here. There was alcohol in that press room. And Thompson would sit down and come in your office and say, what are you drinking? And, you'd have a drink with him. That got to in a way, I think all of us kind of welcomed that attitude from the governor. We were, had a little bit of combat fatigue from dealing with Walker. But it didn't take long for that to begin to raise questions about how you're going to write critically, if you have to, about this guy who's in your office, maybe while you're beginning to write the piece.
Well, and who you personally like,
Yeah.
who's personable.
Yeah.
And I think that brings up an interesting point. I know we've talked about this in the past, with different personalities, whether you be a legislator or a governor. And Thompson was notorious for that. And of course, I was fairly young when I started out in this business, and I remember being a page in the Senate, and Pate Phillip was then the Republican leader, and Phil Rock was the president of the Senate. And Thompson would come on the floor at the end of session and plop down in a chair next to it, and it did. Going back to the first segment where we talked about the excitement that being in a newsroom where all the different noises in the old days was. I mean, it was a very similar concept where, it said that, one, I'm acknowledging the General Assembly. And, some governors do that better than others, and some believe that that's not their role. And I think you can go on both sides of that issue. Mm-hmm. But Thompson certainly was, and as you mentioned, that he was really the first governor to go on and really lobby for pretty big issues on both the House and Senate floor. I didn't know that. I find that fascinating. But yeah, he was always pretty active, and people liked him. They thought of him as doing a good job, but also there was something about his personality that people wanted to be around him and support him, even if they didn't always agree with him. Because I think, if I recall, the unions were actually supportive of Thompson in his third re-election?
Well, it's hard to keep track of all of his
I know. He was in their
re-elections.
office for quite some time.
Yeah, he was in there for 14 years. But yeah, he got along well with people. He had his issues as governor, and by that I don't mean to imply anything in the ethical area, but it wasn't all sweetness. As a matter of fact, one of the classics, and you mentioned Senator Phillip, the presiding officer of the Senate, was when Thompson decided in 1983 we needed an income tax increase. And the Democrats, Phil Rock, the Democrat leader, endorsed it almost right away. But other Democrats say, wait a minute, it's a Republican governor, we gotta have a Republican sponsor on that bill. Well, the Republican sponsor, of course, would have been the Republican leader in the Senate, Senator Phillip, and he was very, very reluctant. He finally agreed to put the bill in. It was the one and only time that I know of in Illinois history where a sponsor put the bill in and added by request. And Philip was asked the day he put the bill in, what do you think the chances are for this bill? Now, the leading sponsor of the bill's answer was, it'll pass when hogs fly. So, and Pate had a colorful way of putting things. Actually, the income tax increase it did pass, although it was temporary at that time, and people will laugh when you mention temporary tax increase. A lot of them have a way of becoming permanent.
Which that one did.
Yeah, well, that one actually did go off. It went off a year and a half later with Madigan's tax increase that became permanent in '91. But it went off, but there was probably what you're thinking of, there was a sales tax increase, and that was permanent.
Okay, I could be getting that confused. I do remember being in the Senate, and that was the surcharge that was made permanent, and that was, okay, so we're
89.
talking about, yes, 89.
The years go by.
It really, truly, they do. But you brought up Speaker Mike Madigan, who is now, I think, in the running to be, if not already, the longest-serving speaker.
He is.
In the
by
nation.
Many, yeah. In the nation.
In the
right.
nation, yes, certainly in
in
Illinois.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting, obviously the longevity of his career just in general, and the numerous people who have worked for him. I mean, you really have a lot of people who are now, and have been for years, all over state government, that at one point worked for the Speaker of the House. Now, of course, you also mentioned Republican leader Lee Daniels, who did a very short stint in the late 90s as Speaker.
Yeah.
It was a quick 2 years
Right.
before Speaker Madigan took back control. But anything that you care to, talk about? I know when you were with Governor Edgar, you always maybe didn't see eye to eye with the Speaker of the House on certain, policy issues and so on and so forth. And how is that, aspect of working with him? And then, you have, of course, the Senate side of things that partially were Senator Pate Phillip, who you also mentioned, and just the kind of atmosphere and the mood back then. I mean, I kind of seem to recall it, and there were times where things went fairly smoothly and times where they didn't go all so smoothly.
Yeah, there's a controversy now because Pat Quinn cut off pay for legislators, which I think was not a good move, particularly in the long term. But back then in the governor's office, there might have been days when I would have been in favor of eliminating the legislature. But in my cooler moments, I then returned to the separation of powers that our founding fathers in their wisdom established. Madigan, of course, is one of the most fascinating people that I covered or worked with in government. First of all, there's the Madigan mystique. And I think he's created that in 2 or 3 or 4 ways. One is he outworks everybody in that what I call the island of state government. I mean, he outworks everybody on the island of state government. Jim Edgar worked very hard, but Madigan outworked everybody because it was just something he did almost, 24/7. He has personal discipline. He for lunch every day he eats sliced apples. Maybe not every day, but I think almost every day. But it's more than that. Most people who are in politics, they want to talk. And Madigan has the capacity not to talk. Now, that frustrates people. It frustrates the media when he won't talk about something for a period of time, or at least not say where he is, but that actually empowers him because he's able to, hold his hand without exposing it for a longer period of time than others. And he also is someone who knows his members on the House Democrat side and has a very good sense of what he can push them on to vote for that won't hurt their chances for re-election, and what he's not going to push them on. The other thing with Madigan, and there are negatives, and I can get to them in a couple of minutes here. Well, not a couple of minutes, we won't take that long. But one of the things about Mike Madigan, if he gives you his word, he keeps it. If he says he's going to do something, he does it. And that's getting to be a rarer quality in the State House. Madigan and Edgar, the first term was a little rough. Madigan decided he was going to be the anti-Edgar. And they would come to agreements at the end of session, but it was not pretty getting there. The second term was different. Madigan had been beaten. He was out for the 2 years. You referred to that. And he really came into Edgar and said, you know what? I learned I can't fight you all the time. There are going to be things we disagree on, but I'm going to be your ally when we do agree. And he was. And when Madigan would say on an issue, I'm going to put X number of votes on the board for you on this issue, they were there. There was no messing around. They were there. You could count on them and go to the bank. Madigan and I, during the first Edgar term, though, we'd actually had talked quite a bit when I was a reporter. But when we'd end up on the state plane during Edgar's first term, we didn't talk about government or politics. We talked about Notre Dame football. Madigan had gone to Notre Dame as an undergraduate, and I'm a big Notre Dame fan. We talked about that and history in state government, what might have happened 15 or 20 years ago, but not what was happening at the moment. Now, I think the longer he's been in office, and I think this would be true with just about anybody, the more of a sense of entitlement and power he feels. And I think there is such a thing as someone after many, many years in a job kind of reflecting and saying, would this be a good time for me to leave? And I thought he would leave as his daughter's campaign for governor became more closer to fruition. He didn't. And I frankly was surprised by that. I am, I think there are a lot of arguments against term limits by law, but I am someone who believes that people ought to serve a certain period of time and move on. I never felt I wanted to be a lifer in government. I told Governor Edgar before he ran for a second term that I'd be all involved in his campaign for re-election, but I would not stay for the full second term. Edgar himself made a wrenching decision not to run for that third term. It was wrenching. It's hard to leave those spots, but I do think that those in public office ought to consider the fact that there's a season for everything and for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point, and it kind of goes back to what we were speaking about earlier in the segment, that you always want to have somebody who is going to be someone who is going to tell you that straight, like, you know what, it might be time. And I think it would be hard, like you mentioned. I know that Governor Edgar did very much so struggle whether he was going to go further in his political career or not, and just say, you know what, I've done what I wanted to do. I'm comfortable with my choice. that would be difficult, particularly because, I mean, his popularity at the time was still off the charts. And I think that would be difficult for an elected official, just to walk away from something that really that's what you've known and done,
Yeah.
and are good at.
Yeah.
So I think, and you're right about the Madigan mystique. It's always been fascinating, and I don't care what age you are or what level you work in state government. I mean, I remember distinctively when I had a job that allowed me to go on the House floor and the Senate floor. And when he would walk onto the House floor, the entire room, and it didn't matter if you were Republican or Democrat, was silent. You could hear a pin drop. And it was almost as if, I don't know if he even recognized that or not. My guess is, you're right, he plays his cards very close to the vest. You really never know where he's at. When he does speak, it's very well thought out. I heard him a couple times, of course, the pension crisis in Illinois, where, he spoke about what he would like to see happen in regard to that. But it's very robotic and very intentional. And but it does work for his intimidation factor, because it's certainly there, whether he has actually orchestrated himself or not. It definitely is still there, and a very active part of that whole dynamic that goes on with the legislature and the governor's office and state government in general. Other characters, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention, the current president, Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. I distinctly remember, I believe at the time I had my consulting practice, but you asked me if I had met the new state senator yet. Mm-hmm. And at the time I hadn't met Barack yet, but you told me, and I remember this distinctively because I do listen to what you say. You said, well, he's really something. You should meet him. I'm impressed by him, and honestly, I think he could go all the way. Now, what I thought you meant is possibly governor. You didn't mean that. You meant President of the United States, and ironically, years later, he's the President of the United States, which was kind of telling and revealing. But I remember the first time you met him, and he was very active in the first ethics reform. Yeah. It was spearheaded really by the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute.
Yeah, and he worked well in that project. We had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans from the legislature working together, and in that bipartisan situation, he worked well. He had his thoughts about where campaign finance ought to go, and some of those things were adopted, some were not. And yet he recognized that, a lot of reform is incremental. So, but one moment I remember, we were getting down to the wire about if we were going to get something together, actually getting it through in that session. I mean, the session was about a week away from when it was supposed to end, and we had an issue when we went to draft the legislation. It had to be drafted a certain way to withstand constitutional scrutiny, and I said, by that time we had 2 or 3 staff people and some lawyers involved, and I said, who wants to take a shot at this? And Obama said, well, I will. And I said, well, I don't know anybody better than a constitutional law professor from the University of Chicago. Well, he did that, but the next day he was supposed to have that language. And he came into the meeting. By that time we were meeting every day, and I said, well, the first order of business here, Senator, do you have that language? And he said, well, I'm sorry, I left it down in my office. And I can get pretty intense, as you know, and I said, we don't have much time. We've got to, we got to move. He said, oh, okay, come down to my office afterwards. Well, I went down to his office in the Capitol, and he said, here it is. He said, you get pretty intense. And I said, well, yeah, I do, and, it's all about my view of how you get things done. He said, we're cool. Well, I thought about that, of course, when he became the leader of the Western world. I've thought about that moment a few times. If we've got time, I'd like to talk just a bit about Governor Ogilvie. We're going a long way back. But Ogilvie, first of all, the first time I met Ogilvie was we were at a fish fry in Henderson County. and which is on the Mississippi River. And I knew Ogilvie was then president of the Cook County Board, and I knew that he was starting to run for governor. He was, if he was at a fish fry in Henderson County, he was interested in being more than president of the Cook County Board. Well, he stood, there was a long line of people waiting to eat fish. And he stood to the side of the line as people would go by. He would say, "Hi, I'm Dick Ogilvie. I'm president of the Cook County Board, and I'm thinking about running for governor." And the people would say, "Nice to meet you," and they'd move on. Well, I was in the line, and he said that, and then I told him what I did for a living. I was a reporter, and we started talking a little bit. And this woman behind me said, "I don't care who either one of you is. I want to eat fish." Now, Ogilvie and I laughed about that for several years. But Dick Ogilvie, of course, was the governor. He was a rare guy. He, you know, he championed the first income tax in Illinois. He was willing. He'd been a tank commander or at least had been an officer involved with, you know, the artillery and been shot and wounded. But he had gone to Yale, and as he told me in an interview, he and his classmates were told, if you're fortunate enough to be here at Yale, you have a responsibility to lead. And that was the attitude that Dick Ogilvie took into the governorship. Now, it was interesting. I told you about and your viewers about the fish episode. The other one that really stands out in my mind on a personal level like that with Ogilvie was when he was running for re-election in 1972, and he lost to Dan Walker. Walker beat both Ogilvie and Paul Simon in that year. But when he lost, towards the end of the campaign, I'd written a story that was not, something that his campaign wanted. And it was about something they were saying was spontaneous when he would appear in public, and I pointed out that no, it wasn't, it was staged. And I did that with some pain because privately I really wanted Ogilvie to win. I thought highly of him, but the facts were the facts, and I wrote this story. And the next time I saw him, I mean, it was late in the campaign, the next time I saw him was after he'd lost. And there was a party that he gave for reporters at the mansion. Governors in those years would host a series of Christmas parties, one of which was to have reporters in. And I remember I was with someone and Ogilvie came up, and that's the first time I'd seen him since I'd written that story. And we shook hands, and he said to the person I was with, he said, "I don't always agree with what Mike writes, but I know that he's sincere about what he does, and I know he does his job as a professional." You know, that really meant a lot to me because he was not happy about losing. You wouldn't be.
Right.
And I know he wouldn't have been happy about that story I wrote. But anyway, that memory, I used to say I'll never forget. In this day and age, I don't know whether you can say that, so I say I hope I will never forget that.
That's correct. I mean, it's getting harder and harder to remember things. I mean, I understand that myself. But I like that story, and I think goes to a point that we briefly touched on earlier, and that is the fact that, unfortunately, there are so few people now in Illinois state government that you can rely on their word. And, I certainly don't have the same, span of years that you do, but now I've been involved in Illinois politics for 20. Yeah. Over 20, actually. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, a couple people we've touched on, you're absolutely correct. If they told you something, their word was good. And there's way too many individuals now that either won't give you an answer because they don't want to be on the hook for stating one way or the other they're going to vote on a piece of legislation, and or they just don't have enough respect overall for the process anymore where they just don't care if they say one thing and do another.
And that's fundamental
It
to
is
the
fundamental.
process, as you know. You got to have that trust there, that even if you disagree on an issue, you know where the other person is.
Right.
And that allows you then to work together on the next issue. And it's part of being a professional. And I'm proud of you and the professional that you are. And I just think it's essential. And as a reporter or in government, I I made sure that if I said something that I was going to do something, that I did it, or there were times when I didn't particularly want to say it because I knew it would make the other person unhappy if I said it, but you say it. And that's really being fair to other people when you do put it out there and let them know where you are. And then you deliver one way or another on where you are.
Well, and there's no shot at second credibility. You've said that to me for
Yeah.
years, and integrity is such a important aspect of it that I fear has gone too far on the wayside. That's not to say everyone has that issue now, but it's fewer and far between. And you're right. I mean, if you're Wood, it's similar to being a reporter. Is somebody who is an advocate for public policy issues. Right now, my subject matter is different than my primary manufacturing business background. But you have to have that credibility with someone. I mean, if they need information from me about a certain thing and how it impacts whatever issue, I've got to be straightforward. I've got to give all the information. And a good lobbyist, like a good reporter, it tries to tell both sides of the story.
Right.
I mean, you have to give as fair, and just hope your side of the argument that given day is better. But nonetheless, either way, you're going to win some, you're going to lose some. I equate it to that very often. Well, it might not be this best issue, and it may go down in flames when I want it to pass. But there's always going to be another piece of public policy. We all have to work together, but you've got to have that commonality. You've got to have that trust factor. Because without it, it's very hard to do that kind of line of work when you can't trust those that you look to.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the problems today with the dysfunction of government largely here and in Washington, but particularly I pay attention to Springfield and the State House. There is a fundamental lack of trust among the leaders, the governor and the leaders. And it is very difficult, if not impossible, to do business when you have that lack of trust.
And true, and then the atmosphere can become quite toxic when you have that kind of an atmosphere.
Yeah.
I really noticed it, and we didn't talk about this personality. We certainly don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but when Rob Blagojevich was governor of this state, I mean, the absolute toxic atmosphere in the Capitol building was palatable. I mean, you could cut it with a knife. It was very interesting, and in a lot of respects, very sad because you think Illinois has got such a horrible reputation nationwide now. People, I mean, it's kind of a joke. When one of my previous employers, I traveled a lot to Minnesota, and I mean, I recall walking through the airport as if I had Illinois tattooed on my head, and they were arresting, and I'm looking down, and nobody knows I'm from Illinois walking through the airport. But nonetheless, it was one of those moments where you think, oh, geez, what's next? When is the other shoe going to drop? But
Yeah. Well,
it's challenging.
Yeah, it's challenging. It's sad right now. The fiscal situation actually sickens me. But the fact of the matter is that people like you will be involved, other young people. It's time for us, my generation, maybe the one even right behind me, to pass the torch. You need to move into those roles. And the one thing that bothered me about my students was that they had this negative attitude about getting involved. They weren't going to get involved. I do think that the generation that I taught, those students, they actually wanted to make a difference in their communities, a positive difference. They did not see government and politics as the way to do that. And I used to tell them, you may not want to be involved, but the fact you're not involved doesn't mean that decisions aren't going to be made, important decisions that affect your life and your future. And somebody's going to be making those decisions. And if you may not like the decisions, and you may not feel comfortable with the people who are making the decisions. So you've got to be involved to try to affect that process. If you're going to make a difference, you've got to be in what I call the arena. You got to be in there. You don't necessarily have to be in there up to your eyeballs the way I was, and frankly you are. But you got to be involved at least to some extent in that arena. And for that reason, I'm proud of the fact you are involved, and I have no regrets about the time that I was more deeply involved, and even at my advanced age now and in retirement, I have stayed involved to some degree in the arena, and I think I'll always be involved as long as I have the capability to do so.
Yeah, and you passed along a lot of your beliefs and thoughts and traits, which are all obviously very good and much needed in today's society, to your students that you taught, who are, I know numerous of them now, who are walking around the Capitol in their various roles, and I think that message resonated with them, and you're absolutely correct. I mean, if you aren't going to be part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And by not engaging, when you do want to make a difference, is being part of the problem, because I think that we need some fresh ideas. We need younger people. We need to have a more open conversation on how we move this state forward, because it's in anyone's benefit. I mean, you're reading all over the place, whether it be businesses are leaving Illinois, or citizens who are just fed up with how things are not moving along. And I think that we all have a responsibility, and it's people like you who have the institutional memory and the experiences that you do that make what you have to say valuable, and then it's the energy of the younger generations coming up that can put those good ideas into motion. So if you could touch on the quintessential Paul Simon, that would be great.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm glad to do that. I had known Paul for more than 30 years before we began working together. Now, I knew him as reporter to public official, reporter to candidate, but I saw the opportunity to work with him as a real plus, and he and I developed a really good personal relationship as well as a professional relationship. And Paul was somebody of high integrity. I think that's probably how many Illinoisans remember him, or at least look at his principal asset. I mean, Paul was a liberal, and there were conservatives who voted for him every time he was on the ballot, because they knew that the beliefs he held were sincere and that he was an honest individual. What a lot of people didn't recognize about Paul, and I didn't, in those first 30 or 35 years I knew him, was how intense he was in his own way. Not the way I was intense, not even the way that Jim Edgar was intense internally. Edgar was pretty cool externally. I hope I was too. But Paul did not want to waste a minute of a day or a week or a year. He was driven in that sense. He knew that, like with all of us, there was going to be an end point, and he wanted to get as much done in that time as he possibly could. So one of the stories I remember was we were on a Sunday afternoon. We were over at the law school for a meeting of the dean of the law school. Now, the meeting had been scheduled to last an hour and a half, which was very unusual. Paul did not like long meetings, neither did I. But we were talking about an upcoming initiative. Well, we got done in 45 minutes. We had another event then at, maybe 2 hours later. I said, now, Paul, you've got an unscheduled 45 minutes or an hour. We're right across from the campus lake. You can take a walk around the lake. There is a nice path. I said, the law library is here, you can go in and read. And he laughed, he knew what I was getting at. He said, no, I'm going to go back to the office and dictate some letters. I mean, that was Paul. But the other thing I've told people about Paul, he had an impressive public career. A lot of people don't realize that he was a sponsor, one of the chief sponsors of legislation to establish the community college system in Illinois. He went to the federal level, sponsored literacy legislation, was viewed as somebody who would stand up on the floor of the Senate and talk about issues in a way that most politicians would not. But where I saw in him, and I came to realize in him, was that he made more of a difference than any public official I worked for, or not that I worked for, that I interacted with, in meetings, just brief meetings with individuals. He could, for example, there was a bellhop at the Hyatt Regency on Wacker Drive, and this young man, Paul would engage people in conversation, and he would ask them about themselves. Well, this young man was trying to debate whether to go on with his education. He was trying to make some money. He didn't have a lot of money, and Paul gave him that magical word of inspiration, or words of inspiration. And after Paul died, this person wrote a note saying how much that meant in his life and what a difference. We got dozens, maybe scores of those notes where he had had some encounter in an airport or somewhere and it changed somebody's life. I mean, that is a rare quality.
Very rare.
I feel fortunate. I worked for Paul Simon and Jim Edgar. I'm very proud of what Governor Edgar did in his administration, and he was a good man to work for. And then I had the opportunity to work with Paul Simon as well. So as I say, I felt very fortunate.
With that, thank you very much. This has been an opportunity of a lifetime.
Same for me.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.